Well, everybody, welcome to Karl Sandoval's channel of guitar fabrication, instructions, and lecture, whatever you want to call it. All right, today I need to discuss a little bit about Floyd Rose installation, and I'll try and be as clear as possible in my explanation, but I think a lot of you out there will find this interesting. But before we get started, let me just thank everyone for their contributions on Patreon. Patreon is really beginning to look up, and if you haven't subscribed to my Patreon channel, by all means, please do so. This video will be on Patreon. I will not share videos like this in detail on YouTube, but maybe once in a while. So tell your friends, motivate them into helping support my Patreon channel by subscribing. I believe it's only $5 a month. So anyway, with that being said, there's also, I have YouTube channels. A YouTube channel which you can subscribe to, and there's many good videos that will come on there. You can check out my Instagram. I'm on Facebook. You can send me an email at karl@karlsandoval.com. I spell my name with the letter K. Those would be my website, those would be the avenues of how you can see what Karl Sandoval is all about. Okay, so let's get started here. Well, as you can see, I have an original Floyd Rose. I am in no way sponsored by this company. It's just a bridge that I really have found to be quite successful in incorporating this style of bridge with my custom guitars. So this happens to be the original version, and what I'll do is just kind of unpackage it here, and we'll see what we got. Let's start off with that. They got it wrapped up pretty good. A lot of foam here. Here's our bridge. If you haven't seen an original Floyd Rose Tremolo, this is what they look like. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is rotate it so you can see the back or the block area. There's our block. You can see the tension springs for the fine tuners. And basically you have your tremolo arm insertion hole here. You've got 6 saddles that actually rotate up and down. They are fine tuned with these black Allen head screws. They're fairly long. And then you've got these fine adjustment rotating screws on top. When you screw them clockwise, okay, let me restate that. When you turn these small screws clockwise, they press on this Allen screw and cause the tuning to go sharp. If you turn these little screws counterclockwise, it causes the tuning to go flat. Now these 6 black hex screws here, or Allen screws here, they're adjustments. You tighten them or loosen them for adjusting the saddle to go forward or backward. That would be for intonation. It's a very solid bridge. It's very heavy, and you've got a tremolo arm that inserts in this hole. Let's see if I can get this on camera so you can see. It inserts in this hole, and then you have a set screw that you tighten. And if you loosen this slightly, the set screw here, the arm will swing pretty freely. Some guys like that. Now if you want it set, you tighten that, and then it's got compression in there. There's like a compression ring, and then it will hold the arm in a particular position wherever you want it, which is kind of cool. So that's the basic bridge there. We'll set that down. And inside the box you get a smaller box. This is all kind of different. This is new. I've never seen this, which is actually cool. You don't have parts floating around all over inside the box during transit, scratching up the chrome. This is really nicely chromed. It looks very pro. On the side here it says, this is how you know if you have a Floyd Rose. It'll say Floyd Rose right up here. If it doesn't say that, chances are it's not a Floyd Rose. And then, of course, on the back, it's got a stamp that says, Made in Germany. Excellent. Okay, and inside this little box, we have accessories. Let's pull out the bags first, and then we'll just kind of look at everything after that. And I get quite a bit of parts inside that little box. Okay, let's start off here. This is the string retainer. Kind of a must that you need on your Floyd Rose because you want to make sure that this compresses down on the strings, which compress the strings down onto the nut. Very important. It's held on by 2 small screws. And one thing of caution, you got to be careful about. Make sure that you have a pilot hole large enough. Run this screw or a screw like this on a test block of wood and make sure that your pilot hole is large enough to allow this to go in firmly, not too easy, not too tight. If it's too tight, you could snap off the top of these screws. It's a Phillips screw, and I use a little wax on the screw when I insert them in the hole. And that's a little bit of caution there. These are the studs that mount into the body. The black portion mounts into the body, and then the chrome portion is able to, it's a machine screw that screws the up and down, giving you the height adjustment potential. And this is adjusted with, I don't know if you can see that, with an Allen. A little Allen wrench. Okay, here's the lock nut. This happens to be 1 11/16, which is what I use for the width of basically all my guitars, at the nut width. And this needs to be properly installed on the front of the neck, and it needs to be very secure. I usually use wood screws. I don't like to mount through the back of the neck because, in my opinion, that creates a weakness, and then you have a breaking point potential by doing that. That's these black screws here. I don't use those. I use the small wood screws, but are long enough and adequate enough to secure this locking nut to the front of the neck. Now, what I like to do is when I install it, I'll put it in at a slight angle, and it helps to allow the string to come at this pinnacle point, which is the very end of the nut, which is facing the bridge. Otherwise, you'll get a sitar sound, and the string retainer keeps the strings flat onto the nut, which is very important, because if you have any height on that string or any gap in between the string and the nut, and you compress it with these pads, it'll create a tuning problem. It just makes it that much more difficult to tune up the guitar and so forth. So there's 3 pads. You've got the base of the nut. There's 3 locking pads with 3 hex screw or Allen screws that, and when you tighten these onto the strings, you don't need to bear down to where you got to have a 50 torque pounds. You don't need any. It just needs, these pads need to fit on there a good snug amount to hold the string from shifting back and forth. Another caution about mounting this, you want to prepare the mounting area for this locking nut as precise as possible, and you want this nut to lock very, very good onto the neck. On occasion, I'll use a shim, but not likely. I try to set this before the guitar is even. I set the height and the accuracy of this nut with the frets and alignment before the guitar actually goes into paint. So, therefore, when I'm ready to install it, I just clean off the paint if there is any residue in that area, and it secures really nice. You don't want this nut to once the strings lock in here, you don't want it to shift as you're tuning the strings. You don't want it to shift anyway, whether it be sideways, backward, and forward. It needs to really be secured. This is one of the causes of tuning issues with Floyd Rose locking systems. Then, of course, we have our Allen wrenches that you'll be using for the adjustments of the bridge and the nut. And the last bag shows we got a claw, a string claw, the mounting screws for the string claw, and 3 tremolo springs. Now what I like to do is I'll put one spring in the center straight across, and then I use the 2 outside holes on the tremolo block, but I'll come in, let's say this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little hooks. I use the 2 outside springs on 2 and 4. So it gives you a little bit of an angle coming in with the springs towards the claw. But that pretty much takes care of all the parts that are used in getting this bridge installed. So let's put these aside. Now this is a basic rundown. There might be some things that I miss, some points of interest that I miss, but for the most part, I'll do the best I can in remembering all that I do in setting up my tremolos. Now, taking off this tremolo arm. Now, of course, I have a standard tremolo route here that I do. Now, this is for vintage Fender style tremolo routes, and all my guitars that have tremolos start off like this. And it's a procedure that I've been using all along. You can make templates that will do this routing that I'm doing by hand, but I come after the fact and do it this way for accuracy. And bottom line, I just haven't made the template for doing the Floyd Rose tremolo route, because it's like if you route the cavities and the tremolo, why not continue on and do the rest of the routing with templates? But basically, this is going to fit in this position, obviously, and it's going to be recessed down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring over another guitar that shows, this is the before, and then I'm going to bring over another guitar that shows after. This will show the routing that has been done. So give me a short moment here. Silence is golden. Excuse me for that pause there, but here is an example of the Floyd Rose routing that I do after I do a standard routing for a vintage tremolo. And as you can see, this needs to have 2 holes drilled here for the pinnacle point, these studs, but I will insert this in here and kind of basically center up where it's going to go. And I'm going to do a close-up so you can see what it's going to look like. Let's see if I can zoom in here. Excuse my camera movement. Okay, there's a close-up. Now, as you can see, I've got a gap that comes all the way around the Floyd Rose tremolo. And obviously, you need that gap. one of the issues of any tremolo not staying in tune is the fact that you have friction points. That means any of these sides, if they're rubbing, if they're touching, it will create friction. And that's just on the top. And then now on the bottom, you've got friction points too. You've got the block to worry about. Excuse me. And then you have this insert to worry about. So what you have to do is make sure that even inside the cavity you have clearance for the block. As you can see, the block is pretty narrow compared to the route, so there's plenty of room. And then also for this tremolo issue here, the tremolo stud or bushing, I have to do a little channel in depth and also going in a little bit. Now you really want to take off minimal amount of wood, but from the initial route, of course, it was a certain dimension, and okay. Other companies, sometimes they'll route the spring cavity narrow to accommodate the size of the block, which, as you can see, I've got a lot of room on either side here, and that's a fine adjustment you can do, but there's really not that much wood you're going to be taking out. I just like to keep everything simplistic in terms of I have a simple method of routing for tremolos, and it's been working all along, and I haven't had any complaints or comments about well, it's so big and bulky in the back, you route it out. So I'll tell you, one of the most important things about any guitar player and his guitar is the fact that he can play the darn thing and play it well. That's what's important, because then you can perform live really well, you can record well and all that. I mean, the guitar is just part of what a guitarist is all about. So you got to make sure that you minimize all friction points. This depth here, back here, is a 1/2 inch, and this depth here, all along here, that's a 1/4 inch, and that will recess the bridge plenty in order for you to get your action correct. Excuse my moving around here, but I want to do a string. The whole thing about recessing a bridge, there's 2 ways you can install them. One would be top mount, which means there is no recess routing, but you end up having to angle the neck. Here, let me back up here a little bit. There we go. Now, when you recess a Floyd Rose into the body, it gives you a low profile, which means this bridge at this point, it's not sticking up real high, although you still have these screws to deal with. Excuse me. And these saddles are going to be of a certain height. You can't get away from that, because when you have a set-in neck, and it's here, let me readjust this. When you have a set-in neck and it's straight into the body, parallel or even with the face of the guitar, you're going to need, whether it be a stock Fender tremolo bridge or a Floyd Rose, you're going to need this to be set at a certain height. Now, if I use my string guide here, and I'm going to be watching oh, sawdust, this point here, and I'll be able to see that because of the depth of the neck being into the body, I can see at this point right here, I can see that that neck has to, or that bridge has to be elevated. So it's got to come up about well, I'd say a quarter. It's got to come up about, let's say, this much. And this just happens to be a combination of what I do to make these bridges function properly. Now, so there's a certain depth criteria we got to consider, and there's a certain side-to-side positioning and accuracy that we have to consider. So I'm constantly doing string checks. Now watch, if I run this string across here on the low E, then I come over to the high E, I can see at this point on either side of the string, there's the same amount of fingerboard that you want to look at, which is telling me it's accurately set that way. Now, the other thing to check, and you have to be certain of, is the scaling. And this happens to be 12 and a half at the 12th fret, and then another 12 and a half here, which gives you 25 inch. Now that half mark, I don't actually have these saddles set yet, but that half mark, the 25 inch mark, is actually, let's see if I can do this. It's really close. You know, if I move this saddle forward a little bit, you know, it'll be accurate. So, you know, the scale length you got to check, and then the angle of the bridge you got to check and make sure it's not too far in this direction and not too far in this direction. So it's pretty much, we're talking about a center line here. Now, the way I've designed my templates and my typical routings, all these line up to where the string goes over the saddle. It's equally divided on the fretboard, and then it goes over the pull pieces as centered as possible. So we've got the depth here of 1/4 inch at this point, and then we've got a 1/2 inch over here in the back. And being that the bridge comes up, it's elevated, it allows you to pull back. That's why you need this depth here, because you don't want these Allen screws to hit the base here or to hit the back in any way, because, you know, obviously, I mean, it will reach that point where it'll stop, but by that point, I mean, you're pulling up quite a bit, and you can really do some wild things. I had a customer, he was asking about that, you know, basically, how do you set up a Floyd Rose so you can pull back? Or when you install them, can you pull back on your bridges? Obviously, I can. That's the way these are set up. And, you know, it's with a Floyd Rose, since you lock the strings in, it's radical enough to do dive bombs and pullbacks, and you'll be able to accomplish a variety of different soloing techniques. Now, some guys talk about the detuna that Eddie Van Halen uses. I think that's what it's called, but it's on the low E string. And okay, you may have to do some routing to accommodate if you use that type of apparatus on your tremolos. I haven't actually used those, but you know, I have found that pretty much anything is possible when you're building a custom guitar. And you know, you just have to allow for clearance to be able to pull back. Now, another thing that helps in pulling back, if you use like that detuna, I guess it's an apparatus that comes back here, you know, and it's like sticking far back, and so it would hit. But if you have your bridge coming forward a little bit when you set it to where it's slightly up, that means you can pull back farther. And let me tell you, when these strings are locked up in here, man, it's amazing how much throw you've got. But I just wanted to give you a little information. And of course, on the installation of this tremolo, what you want to do is, if you have a center line here, you want to use your square and make sure that everything is squared up. So, you know, I can see that following this line right here, that I've got a 90 right here. And if I pull this over like so, I'm level here, I'm aligned here, and then I'm aligned here at a 90. If I run this over here like this, I'm pretty much aligned here, and I'm at a 90 right here. So what this does is it gives you a squareness, and it looks really pro. And now, since I don't have a template, I freehand route or freehand manipulate my templates, and I route all these lines by eye and by moving the body on the router. Let's say this is the router bit. You know, I move the body precisely, you know, to get these routes done. You know, I'll go back and forth, or I'll come forward like this. So it's, in a sense, that's sort of the router bit is stationary, but the movement of the body and the accuracy of my eye and hand coordination is such to where I can get these straight lines. Now, they may not come out perfect, so I'll put sandpaper on a block, and then let's see if I can demonstrate that. You know, you put sandpaper on a block, you know, and then you come in and you can sand like this, and you can straighten out whatever little bumps or destroys that you got. You know, it may not look straight, but you know, after you sand it with 80 grit and 220, then it'll come out. That's how this was done, and it looks really good. So, you know, what I'll do then is I'll drill these holes for these studs. I'll put the studs in, and that's another key thing where before I do routes like right here, this begins to get a little thin. So if I drill a hole and then press in the studs now, or if I don't drill that hole large enough, this will split. So I may have prematurely routed this a lot. Like, I guess the point I was trying to make is that you don't want to route this area. You want to, even though it's an 1/8 of an inch of material, which really isn't that much, it's probably better to drill the holes then. I just didn't have the bridge at that time to do this first before I routed that. I went ahead and routed everything, so I'm good to go. And I'll just be real careful. I'll put, I'll make sure, well, my holes are drilled large enough so those studs just real snugly press in, and then I use a little bit of epoxy glue. And once they get glued in, they're pretty well solid. And as you can see, they're long. That's about, it's close to, if not 3/4, it's around 3/4 of an inch that goes embedded into the body. And with glue, and being the fact that it's really tight and snug and long and pressed in, it's very stable. On rare occasions, I have seen these loosen up. If your wood is really, really soft, like sometimes it's basswoods or alder or whatever, they can get real soft and they will move, and that hole becomes oblong because you got a lot of pressure on those pinnacle points. But not really. I mean, I think I've only seen that once in my lifetime. But you know, let's just face it. You've got a lot of many pounds of pressure pulling from those strings on these 2 points. But they're like low profile into the body, and the way that it's designed, there really isn't a problem. Many companies use these Floyd Rose tremolos with very high success rate. So, you know, then that's basically a preliminary concept of how some tips that I use in installing these bridges. Measurements, you know, you got to measure. It's kind of a, when I make certain that this area right here, I don't know if you can see this little curve. Let's see, let me get a close-up. I got something that's really important I got to explain here. Oh,